Welcome to We Need to Talk About Farming, a new spin-off series from myself, Will Evans, and the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission. There's a lot of noise in farming right now, and for many, the future feels uncertain. This series is about having better conversations about the biggest issues facing agriculture. In each episode, we'll take on a topic that's making headlines and dividing social media and WhatsApp groups. We'll go beyond the buzzwords, cut through the cliches, and work out what really matters. And in this episode, we are talking about net zero. The net zero drive has become a flashpoint for farming. British farmers will have to make radical changes to meet national targets for cutting emissions. But decarbonisation that treat agriculture like any other industry are switching off farmers and derailing crucial action, not least for preparing for the changing climate. So how can farming become part of the solution? We are joined by Liz Bowles and Ben Taylor Davies. Liz is CEO of Farm Carbon Toolkit, which helps farmers understand and act on their environmental impact. She's worked in a number of roles across the sector and also keeps one of the UK's largest pedigree flocks of Shropshire sheep on her farm in Devon. Ben, also known as Regen Ben, is a farmer and the first self-proclaimed bioagroecologist working to produce healthy food and enhance the environment on his arable farm in Herefordshire. Okay, net zero. Liz, what do we mean by the phrase net zero and how does it connect to climate change?
Okay, so what we mean by net zero is that for any particular entity, the emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions it produces are offset by sequestration or by carbon offsets that have been purchased. So the sum, net sum is zero. For farming businesses, it's similar, but essentially what it means is all the emissions that a business produces generally in a year are met by the farm's ability to sequester carbon either into trees, hedges, or into soils. So that's essentially what it means. It doesn't mean once you've got to net zero in one year that you stay there, because the following year your business will carry on producing emissions, and you can't use the sequestration from last year to offset next year's emissions. So you've got to make further sequestration or what's called carbon removals to offset the following year's emissions.
Yeah, it is. Do you think one of the problems, Liz, and one of the reasons why some farmers kind of maybe burying their heads in the sand a little bit about this, or just kind of turning off from it, is they think it's too complicated?
Oh, well, I think, yes, I'm sure it is that. I mean, I've just, I, I'm attending a meeting today all about the national inventory and LULUCF. And I think if many farmers attended that, they definitely want to put their turn off because it is complicated.
Hmm.
And I think the other challenge is that we know as farmers that agriculture will always produce emissions because it is a biological process.
Hmm.
And the only way that agriculture can get to net zero is to include the carbon sequestration into trees, hedges, and soils to offset those emissions. Of course, there are things that farmers can do to reduce emissions, but there will still always be a certain level of emissions that they simply cannot remove. It's not possible because it's
Yeah.
a biological system. And I think the reason that farmers are getting turned off by it is that they can really see their ability to sequester carbon into soils, trees, and hedges, but it's more difficult to see how they can reduce emissions without affecting output. And then that's where the discussion really starts. The question being, who's actually going to fund that activity if it results in them not being able to produce such high crops or livestock production being reduced? And I think that's where we're at the moment, where the conversation about actually how will this activity be funded is not really it's a talking point, but it's not really being properly talked about by certainly by supply chains and retailers. Some
Yeah.
are, but not many.
Yeah. Okay. Ben, what are some of those main areas of emissions associated from agriculture? I mean, a lot of the work you do is about with your kind of farming is reducing those. What are some of them?
Yeah, I mean, it depends who's measuring, to be absolutely honest, as well. But and therefore, it is, and as Liz said, it's so complex to try and get your head around in
Mm,
terms of with everything else going on, and the worry on farm at the moment of
Mm,
trying to make a margin and a profit without having your focus point taken away. But yeah, I mean, the key carbon emitters at the moment is obviously nitrogen fertilizers. It is absolutely enormous, and then shall I mention the word methane and cattle and everything that goes with
mm,
that as well? And then, of course, as Liz said, soil is a biological process. I mean, I have a portable flux tower. For those that don't understand what that is, it literally measures um, carbon dioxide coming out of soils, and you can
mm.
just plonk it down, and just a resting soil will be respiring around 400 to 4 to 600 ppms of carbon dioxide in its natural state.
that's even with a growing crop.
Yeah, that's with
Yeah,
the
yeah.
growing
Wow.
crop. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, in my world, where we're looking for more biological activity in the soils, of
Mm,
course, more biology means more breathing, living creatures. More breathing, living creatures is more carbon dioxide. So again, it's highly complex. But the two are the big ones, and I think this is for those a real worry is nitrogen fertilizer. And we all know how much crops respond to nitrogen fertilizer, no matter what, and then that of cattle and all ruminants, and the methane they're producing, and then the defense of how long it remains in the atmosphere and how much it does actually contribute to greenhouse gases, and is it a closed loop, an open loop, and all those kind of things.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you're absolutely right, Ben. I mean, I think nitrous oxide from fertilizers is probably bigger than we used to think it is.
Yes.
And methane from ruminants is possibly, I'm not saying it's been overclaimed, but actually there are competing ways to look at it and monitor it, because obviously, as Ben has just said, different greenhouse gases hang around in the atmosphere longer. And carbon dioxide hangs around for 100 years or so, nitrous oxide even longer. By comparison, methane only hangs around, I think it's for 12 years, but
Mm.
it's far more potent once it's been emitted, but it
Mm.
doesn't hang around so long. But nonetheless, all of that being said, agriculture will, by the 2030s, probably be one of the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions in the UK as transport and housing do
Mm.
decarbon by bringing in electricity and renewable electricity. So the spotlight will be well and truly on agriculture.
Yeah. How much progress has been made with it so far, Liz? I mean, you obviously work in this sector. I mean,
Mm.
are we on track to reduce emissions where we need to, or I know some
Depends.
people. It does depend who you
It
listen
de
to on
it
this, doesn't
depends
it?
who you ask, doesn't it? We've
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
this morning we've just seen four different trend lines of UK agriculture emissions, and they're different.
Mm.
Um, I would say that part of the challenge of understanding how much we've decarbonised is down to how we are monitoring it. So, for instance, I'll give you an example. Um, the national inventory that we have been using within agriculture, which is something that DEFRA is responsible and pulls in loads of data from lots of different sources. It's a combination of the amount of activity, i.e., how many tons of fertilizer have we applied, and the emissions factor per unit of that activity. However, it doesn't necessarily include any way of being able to account for improvements in farming practice.
Hmm.
So at the moment, for instance, there's nothing in the inventory for farmers using methane abatement products for ruminants. Neither really is there anything in for many different farming practices. So what I mean by that is a farmer could be doing quite a good job and actually will have reduced emissions, but that won't be accounted for within the national inventory. And at the moment, the major reduction in emissions that the national inventory is showing are coming from the reduced number of ruminants. So yeah, we have reduced emissions since 1990, but I think last year we would have accounted for 12% of the total UK agricultural emissions, compared probably to 10% 3 years ago. So in many respects, there's two sort of things going on. Farmers are changing farming practice, but possibly not as fast as they could, which is where really we talk about the kind of farming practices that can reduce emissions. But then the other thing is how quickly will our measuring mechanisms catch up and be able to capture accurately the impact of that changing practice.
Mm. Yeah.
That makes sense.
It does. I mean, all three of us are farmers. We all have livestock and quite diversified businesses. So, Ben, what are the challenges of decarbonising agriculture for family farms in the UK? I mean, there's tens of thousands, very small, diverse businesses. They're all different, various scales, various different systems. You know, it's well documented that a lot of farms are struggling financially. What are some of the big challenges here?
I think the first major challenge is actually coming up with a policy somehow across the UK where we can all agree that the way we measure carbon is the same farm on farm on farm. I turn up onto farms time and time again with they've had different farm audits from various different groups, and it's wildly different in terms of, and that ultimately leads to a huge amount of confusion.
Yeah.
So it'd be fantastic if we could say, right, the farm carbon toolkit is where we're at, and then we're all comparing like with like, which I think would be massively more important than I've had 5 different farm carbon audits going right back to 1998 was the very first one we had done on the farm. If I try and look at the difference between what we were doing then and now, it does seem like we've reduced carbon, but it was measured in a very, very different way. So that would be one of the largest things and the worries. Is the advice that's been put out there actually good enough advice to actually work out how to decarbonize? In the one sentence you hear, right, we can feed our ruminants X and Y product to reduce their methane emissions, and then you read, I wouldn't eat an animal that's been treated with that, or drink its milk and that sort of thing. I read a huge amount of information, and even I'm at a point, and I still can't work out whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. But on the arable side of things, I think it's a little bit more clear if I'm and people are starting to realize the value of organic matter, the value of carbon in their soils. And for me, it's a very simple thing. The soil thing is, as a farmer, we're better off putting more. If we can put more carbon in our soils than we remove each year, you've got a better farm, you've got a better field, you've got a better future. As long as you don't do it by using huge amounts of artificial fertilizers to do that with. So it's the risk is, I guess, the worry, if I'm honest. And with margins so tight as they are for so many, the worry of doing something different, and perhaps it might be more profitable, but the worry that it really sends you over the edge in terms of financial calamity sort of thing is again another reason of that limbo. I think I don't know what you're finding, Liz. I mean, you go, as a company, you're going around and speaking to these people that you're doing audits on. But Will as well. I mean, you're a farmer. I mean, where are you at? Have you left
Yeah.
there, or you're still hopping on one leg and just wondering where to go?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, Ben. I love the idea of me hopping on one leg. I mean, I absolutely agree with you about for farmers not knowing what's the best thing to do. And probably some of the science isn't yet fixed. So that's another kind of thing. Oh my goodness, what shall I do? And And it is difficult. I mean, there are some really clear things though. So you're absolutely right. Reducing your reliance on nitrogen fertilizer will definitely reduce your emissions. It should make your business more resilient because the price of fertilizer goes up and down like a yo-yo.
Yeah.
And your soil will probably be thank you for it for not using it because you be reducing the acidification of your soil and hopefully improving your soil microbiome, I mean, all the bugs in your soil. So those kind of things, I think, then the challenge, of course, is what do you do instead of using that nitrogen
Cattle
fertilizer?
muck.
Yes, yes, exactly. It's other sorts of manures because you know you don't get something for nothing out of soil. You've got to look after it.
Mm.
And I think that's the sort of then becomes the challenge of some of these things. But I think the biggest thing is to have a really proper conversation about it and talk about it. I mean, that's also partly why we started the Carbon Farmer of the Year competition to sort of start to bring a bit more information and a bit more conversation to this space. The fact that I now know that typically emissions per litre of milk, fat and protein corrected milk, though, in the UK is around one. So 1 kilogram of carbon dioxide equivalent per litre of milk. That's about the average. But there's some farmers who are doing zero point 0.7. That's brilliant. And there's some are up at 1.4, not so good. So
Mm.
it's getting those kind of numbers into your head. We know it, you all know it for your yields for a crop of winter barley, what would be average, what would be fantastic, and what would be rubbish, but we don't necessarily know it for the greenhouse gas emissions of what we do as farmers. So, and it's getting all of that into your head because then you can start to think about it. Because I think one thing farmers are blooming brilliant at is mental maths. So when you've actually got some of that information in your head, you can really start to think about what some of those impacts are. Mind you, I think I might defy you to do it with a greenhouse gas emission because there's so many things that come into it,
Yeah.
but it would be a start. But I just wanted to come back on what Ben was saying about wanting to have footprint numbers that are comparable. I mean, I hear what you're saying, Ben. I really do, because I can understand how frustrating it is. But I have to say this to you, and it won't be music to your ears. So the the factors on which calculators are based don't stay the same because the
Mm.
research changes. So, for instance, we will update our calculator twice a year, and what that will mean for you as a user, and that all calculators do it, it's not just us. And we do it in line with up to date information and changes in the UK inventory or IPCC guidance. Don't know what the I don't know what the IP stands for, but the Climate Change Committee, International Panel of the Climate Change Committee, they'll come up with guidance and we have to align with that guidance. So then things will change. So what we then will do for our users is say, look, recalculate using the new version, using your old data, because otherwise you can't know how you're doing
Mm.
because you're not comparing like with like. And certainly the advice for all farmers would be to choose a calculator that you get on with and stick with it
Yeah.
because you're right, they aren't all the same. However, we have last year we agreed to work with Agricult and Cool Farm Tool, and we are harmonizing our methodologies where we can.
Yeah.
But I'll give you a really daft example of where some of those differences come from. So when it comes to soybean meal usage on farm, some calculators will assume that all that soybean meal comes from non-deforestation sources
Mm.
Yeah.
unless the person putting the data in states otherwise. And other calculators will assume exactly the opposite.
Right.
And that makes a hell of a
I
difference.
Yeah.
bet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there is no agreed way of doing it in the UK at the moment.
Mm.
So nobody's wrong, it's just different.
Yeah.
And I think the only two ways I can see around that is to have a national agreement on some of these things as to how to do it. Or, I mean, we could potentially, if there was national agreement, use what the AIC tell us about the proportion of imported soya that comes from deforestation sources, if you felt you could believe that. I mean, that's the other thing, of course.
Where
Yeah.
do the soils fit into this, Ben? A lot of work you do is with soils. Anyone who's ever read or heard you talk will know that that's one of your main passions. Can restoring soils and improving soil organic matter, can that to a certain extent solve our climate change problems?
And I do think right now we are starting to realise, and the pennies dropped for some long time ago, and for others, all of a sudden, the fifth since the war, when I mean Hitler's got a lot to answer for, love him. But seriously, where we dug for victory, and did an awful lot and took all these wonderful meadows out and things. And for 60 years, we've been living on the back of organic matter of essentially carbon, so and doing rather quite well out of it. And I think we're at the point now, and we're getting very near that point where we've exhausted that resilience in the soil. And that resilience is carbon. And therefore, in actual fact, what we're looking at, and this is the this is the worry, this is why I'm hopping, and everyone else is, the way of getting a farm back into a more resilient position is we need to put grass back into the rotation, whether that be some long term, some short term, and that sort of thing. But in order to remain profitable, that grass needs to be eaten.
Mhm.
And funny enough, they get eaten by rumen, and then you're like, well, am I contributing? But actually, if they're eating grass or herbal leaves and things that haven't been fertilized, and therefore the plant has very much extracted the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to grow and nitrogen out of the soil and biological processes, and therefore essentially energy free, then how can that methane be contributing more to global warming or to climate change than the very fact that surely that's as cyclical as it comes. But I'm pretty sure there's an counter argument coming from Liz in a minute as
Well,
to why that's problematic.
well, yes and no. I mean, you've got to take the balance of it. So I do know that we did some work recently where we were looking at the impact on emissions of moving to a more intensive dairy system to a more regenerative one. And effectively, what that meant was moving from a dairy herd that was producing 11,000 litres, that was indoors all the time, and was relying a lot on purchased feeds and a lot of it, to a dairy herd that was lower yielding, was predominantly outdoors, used a lot more herbal lays, and didn't use much fertilizer. And actually, the emissions per litre of milk were about the same.
Mm.
The emissions per hectare were quite a lot lower,
Mm.
but you could argue there was less milk produced per hectare, although there was less ghost area required because the farm wasn't buying in as much product. So it's always, you have to look at the sort of the emissions, and there might, in the scenario you're suggesting, you're substituting methane emissions from a ruminant for nitrous oxide emissions from a fertilizer.
Mm.
Then it's just a question of where that balance sits. But also it was the introduction of fertilizers as well, nitrogen fertilizers post Second World War, that also drove a golden age, I suppose, for arable farming, to be able to reduce carbon stocks in soil and produce a lot of food
Yeah.
through
Yeah.
using nitrogen fertilizers, which is great. I don't think we appreciate, well, we didn't realize what we were doing to our soils, and they have now got to a very low ebb, that's for certain, certainly within arable rotations. And farmers really are the solution, other than the kind of solutions that are attractive because they're high tech, like carbon capture and storage. All those things are really expensive. They're not actually, we don't even know that they're going to work, but they can potentially capture a lot of carbon. And by comparison, us talking about, oh, we're going to improve our soil organic matter and we're going to let our hedges get a bit bigger, doesn't somehow seem quite so exciting and shiny. But nonetheless, we know that if you can increase your soil organic matter by, was it 0.1%, that's equivalent to 9 tonnes a hectare store. But of course, you've got to keep it there.
Mm.
And I think that's the bit with farmland soils. We know that carbon cycles in the soil, so it'll be there and then it'll go somewhere else and it'll come back again. And actually what we need to be thinking about is, over time, what is the trend of increasing that soil organic matter. It doesn't really matter if it's the same molecule of carbon that was there last year, as long as there's a bit more there the following year, and also that we can get it down through the soil profile. And as far as the Climate Change Committee is concerned, there is not enough evidence for the ability of soils to carry on increasing soil organic matter levels for them to include much offsetting from soil carbon storage within, say, their 7th carbon budget. And that's why within that budget that they published, I don't know, it was in about February time, they are recommending to government that by 2050 we will have reduced our ruminant livestock population by 38%. Now that's massive. And that also we should have increased our tree area by, I can't remember what the number is now, 1 million hectares or so. And certainly some of the work I'm doing is to actually to analyse the impact of farming practice on soil carbon stocks. So we do have some credible evidence to provide to the Climate Change Committee so that they can bring this in to their calculations, because not only would that give more confidence to farmers, because at the moment I don't know, Ben, whether you've even looked at the 7th carbon budget, but it's a terrifying document, really, because if policy is made on the back of us needing to reduce ruminant populations by that much, irrespective of whether we're eating meat and drinking milk, to me seems a bit bonkers.
I mean, it's incredible. Interesting enough, you're doing some studies, and I've been studying my own farm for 9 years now, where I've got 6 GPS points.
Yeah.
On the 17th of March every year, on that day, we go and do a 15 centimetre and then a 15 to 30 centimetre sample sent away. And we do an active carbon potassium permanganate test. We do mass, and we do loss and ignition. Again, that's another conversation, but it's probably not today.
Well,
It's how we actually measure soil carbon. And I've been doing that for 9 years. And where the herbal ley now comes into the rotation for 3 to 4 years, the increase in carbon at both depths is enormous, absolutely enormous. But when we then go and put a wheat or whatever into that field after the herbal ley, it doesn't go back to the bottom of the stairs. It doesn't just totally evaporate. No. And I think that's the really important thing to understand, that in actual fact, you can build soil carbon and soil resilience. You might go up 4, 5, 6 flights of stairs and then come down a flight, but you never seem to go back to the zero as soon as you start making those improvements. And in terms of water holding capacity, 1 kilo of organic matter will hold 17 litres of water. Well, from the weather we seem to be having these days, it'll either be fantastic for when we get far too much water and regulate this amount, and why farmers aren't in conversation with insurers and saying, well, I'll increase my organic matter to slow the flow of water and therefore stop flooding downstream. And
our insurers are really interested in that as a product.
Is there? That's great. So let's hope that conversation happens. And sell these services, not necessarily all government handouts all the time, but actually go to these places and say, this is what we've got and this is how we're doing it. And then in the summer, when we have a drought like we've had this year, then that 17 litres of water is rather quite useful as we go further and further into a spring in terms of yield and what that can give. So I can't see a negative of trying to put more carbon in your soil, irrelevant or irrespective of the whole net zero debate and argument. It's just a good thing.
Yeah.
No, I'd absolutely agree with you on that, Ben. What I'd add to it as well, I think water is going to become really, really important as we go forward. And certainly, I think there's real opportunities for farmers to think about an area of land which they jointly farm and how together they can actually do things to help other parts of society. So, for instance, where I farm at the top of a hill, which is above the X and not that far from Exeter St David's Station, that they regularly get flooded when the Exe overflows its banks. I reckon if farmers who farm the ground that is adjacent to that could slow the flow to slow down water getting into the Exe, that would help them.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
then you've got to think about how do you construct those conversations to happen. But I think it will become more important as time goes on that we do that.
Yeah. Oh, well, on that then, on the conversations aspect, how should we talk differently about net zero and farming? Because I mean, we mentioned this earlier with the kind of right-wing politicians, and some people are just absolutely denying that it's a thing at all. How do we balance that sense of urgency with the need to bring people along? I mean, I was part of a net zero group in Wales that a former Welsh politician brought together from people represented from all sectors, energy, building, agriculture. And just the fact that I was on that group, some farmers were shouting at me about it, on social media, just because I was on there having those conversations. It angers some people. So how do we, but nevertheless, we've got to take those people with us. How do
Yeah,
we,
of
how do we talk
course.
about it
Yeah.
differently, Liz?
Weather, I would say, because actually we're going to have to adapt our farming practices to the weather we're getting.
Yeah.
And how we adapt our farming practices is pretty much the same type of things that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So, and it's back again to soil.
Mm.
It's primarily about making sure that our soils are better proofed against both floods and droughts, because that will help in terms of adaptation to climate. If I'm thinking about how am I going to cope with what I now know is the future weather patterns, which basically is it's not going to rain much from going to snows either the end of March, end of April, or end of May until September, and then it ain't going to stop raining for 5 or 6 months, and so therefore we. But I know it's difficult because the weather won't be the same every year. But there is a pattern emerging, I think, which we can probably use that as a better way in. Because I think with net zero, I understand that it isn't that understandable, is it? That's the problem with it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I also think the basics of greenhouse and global warming, climate change, whatever you want to call it, I don't think even the basics are well taught, well understood.
Oh
I
no.
mean, one thing you can't deny at the moment that it seems like nearly every month a record falls.
Mm.
Yeah.
Hottest, driest, windiest, wettest, and I'm 49 years of age, and I don't think there's probably a record now of any month or any year that hasn't now been broken in my lifetime. And certainly in the last 10 years is getting more and more. So the very fact that the extremes are becoming the norm
Mm.
is frightening. And therefore, like I said on the last one, we have to put resilience into the business. And how do you do that? Well, you have to put carbon into the soil.
Yeah. And I think the other way, actually, I would say to get farmers interested is to talk more about I don't call it ecosystems necessarily, but it's natural capital. So the idea of joining up habitat. So the wildlife that wants to call your farm home can. And I find that really helpful for me to think about what would want to live on my farm and how do I provide it a home and food for every month of the year. Because then it subtly changes how you think about your farm. And it doesn't mean that you're going to you're not going to rewild your farm, but at the same time, it helps how you think about what you're doing. And it also means you start to notice that when you've got more insects, you've got more pollinators, actually some of the other things get better as well.
Yeah, but I also think the trouble is with that everybody wants to be paid for it. If I take out a small area of my farm, I want paying for it. And the problem being, and the reason wildlife and carbon was so wonderfully stored in our farms pre-war was if you were walking behind a plough and then had to walk behind a horse to till it, but knew that corner of that field never made you any money at all and any profit, you would never go and think about ploughing it. I mean, what? I mean, it's ridiculous. the easiest days of sitting on a tractor and driving up and down and cultivating a whole field from corner to corner because it's easy. Why on earth, with all the technologies we've got, we can't draw things like gross margin maps and start realizing that, in actual fact, for the last 10 years, that has lost me money
Mm.
every single year by cropping it. Therefore, I may as well either not crop it and let it either rewild or plant trees or do that sort of thing, habitat, ecosystem, whatever you want to call it.
I'm conscious of time here.
This is
Yeah.
a big subject. We could talk about it all day. So let's
Yeah,
wrap
we
this up
definitely
with the
could.
last question for both of you. What's one thing you've read, watched, or listened to recently that you would recommend to listeners who are interested in this topic? Ben?
I mean, I'm a reader, as you know, and one of the books that I really enjoy reading because I find him very controversial, but puts it in such a salient point is Dieter Helm and his book Net Zero. I think everybody should read that. It's a wonderful book, wonderfully articulated, and really did just yeah. And for me, it really did just put points as he does in such a fantastic way. So I think that's a great book to read.
Mm.
Okay. And you, Liz?
I've got loads actually, Will, but I'll very quickly go through the sort of three that I've been reading most recently. So the first one is a book called Ploughing a New Furrow by Malcolm Smith. And it's one of those books that when you read it, you think, oh, of course that's what it's like. But you didn't realize that before you read the book.
Yeah.
And what he's done is really set out how we've got to where we are in terms of agriculture and the environment, and then starts to talk about the kind of things we have to do in order to actually get ourselves to a more sustainable place where we're farming with nature and not against it. So that's one. And the second one, I read it a while ago, but it's always kind of with me, and it's the Dasgupta review, where he's basically making the case that we don't properly factor in the environment into our economic thinking, and basically making the case to say we must. And actually, until we do, we won't properly value the environment. And then the third one, which really is probably a minority sport, but it's something I've been really interested in. Oh, golly. In fact, I think probably ever since I went to my first Oxford Farming Conference, which was about a decade ago now, is the microbiome and how it really moves from the soil to plants, to animals, and to us, and how actually making that those microbiomes all kind of working successfully and in balance will ultimately make us all a lot healthier. And there's so we don't know anything about this yet, but we're starting to at least know the questions to ask, and I find that really exciting.
Okay. Um, that's brilliant. It's such a difficult subject, but hopefully we've shed a bit of light on it for listeners today. So thank you very, very much for joining us, Ben and Liz, and thank you all listening at home for joining us for another episode of We Need to Talk About Farming.